They made major changes to several metagame-defining cards. Let's jump into this analysis of the OTA patch. First things first, probably the most impactful change that they're going to make in this entire patch, and maybe one of the most impactful changes they're going to make over a longer period of time. Sandman gaining a point of power, but losing his defining ability of restricting opponents and you to only playing one card on the final turn of the game. This is now an ability that is basically just Dream Dimension on a stick. So first thing, let's talk about whether or not Sandman will survive and what his competitive viability is. And then second thing, there is another concern to raise here. Bluntly, I do not think the Sandman deck survives this. The deck was predicated on a playstyle that looped around Sandman itself. That deck is still a pile of good cards, but it won't want to be a Sandman deck going forward. It would rather be doing something else in that slot. It's not like you could never win when you were playing Claw on 5, but Sandman was your stopgap. Sandman was what you were built to do. The deck was built to get ahead, play Sandman, and then stay ahead because you played Sandman, and there's a limited amount of what your opponent can do. And you have built your deck with Ultron or Doctor Doom or whatever to be better in the situation where you play Sandman than they have. This provided a meaningful stopgap to decks like Bounce, to decks that were attempting to overload the board on the final turn of the game. But here's the thing, we kind of already have Eliath performing that stopgap role, and so a lot of what Sandman was doing was taking decks that wanted to play like 2 cards or 3 cards, or wanted to contest multiple lanes, and this is the specific thing, on the final turn of the game, and saying, actually, sorry dude, we're just gonna limit this to 1 lane only and you can't beat me. And I think that ultimately I don't necessarily disagree with the idea that that is an unhealthy thing to do. Most Marvel Snap decks are going to do something like attack 2 lanes on the final turn of the game a decent amount of the time because that's how Marvel Snap works. You try to win 2 out of the 3 lanes. Sandman saying, sorry dude, this basic thing that we taught you to do throughout playing the game, you can't do it because I said so. Also, I play Ultron. I get why they would get rid of it. And I think this leads me to my secondary concern. Secondary concern here being Sandman was sort of the last of a dying breed of these like really ridiculous, annoying 5-drops that all sort of came out in Marvel Snap's base set and never really sort of updated with the times, and they weren't problematic until they were, but each one has been problematic in various situations, and usually it's paired with a very aggressive sort of play style where they get ahead and then play the card that slams the door. And by that I mean Leech, by that I mean Doc Ock, by that I mean Profex, by that I mean Sandman. They're all in this sort of vein where it's like they were built for a game that doesn't exist. They were built for a game that doesn't have the early game powerhouses that the current game does. And that is not necessarily an unreasonable assessment to make. Sandman was definitely not a broken card right up until he was, basically. But that does raise a certain question for me, and it is, are these cards that are not necessarily objectively unfun, because, you know, objectively is not a real thing, but are these cards being judged maybe a bit more harshly than something that is more, you know, play a bunch of cards and have it be fine? Like, we keep seeing cards like, I don't know, Sage or whatever, who have, like, good numbers, but not, like, broken numbers. They're totally fine. Those are allowed to exist. They're not a problem at all. But I think a Sandman-type card with similar numbers becomes very problematic because of the play patterns it creates. And I guess that makes me wonder, like, is this an explicit design choice? Are they attempting to send a message to say, hey, look, if your job is making sure that your opponents can't play cards, or making sure that your opponents can't interact, or making the game not feel like a game anymore, or stuff like that, is that just fundamentally on a shorter leash in Marvel Snap? Because I'm not opposed to that. That's fine. But if we assume that it is, that does raise one question about a current dominant strategy, and that's Clog. And this is a weird one, because Clog was not very good until they started printing these very efficient on-rate Clog cards. Kate Bishop and White Widow are the premier, the cream of the crop Clog cards, and this play pattern that the deck has where it's 2 Clogs on the 5th turn of the game, 2 Clogs on the 4th turn of the game. That lane is now clogged because you, like a fool, played 2 cards. I guess I just wonder if that stuff's got kind of a shelf life on it, too. Because it's probably a little bit harder to nerf than it is to nerf Sandman. Sandman, Leech, these are like really obvious targets because they're the card that does the thing. But at some point, I do wonder if we're due for a reckoning with all of the things that sort of go in this vein, and making them a little bit more, or a little bit less good, and a little bit more something you have to go out of your way to do, and a little bit less like, oh, this is always good, and a little bit more like current Sandman, who to me looks like a tech card, maybe? Like, I can't imagine you're building your deck around this guy anymore. He doesn't really do what he used to do, I think. If it turns out he does, hilarious. But I doubt that he meaningfully does. It's possible that there are situations where it's like, this is exactly the same card, and you still force people to retreat, and they're still going to lose to Sandman Ultron. I can actually totally buy that. But it seems like maybe a less likely outcome. I'm really interested to get a chance to play with this card, because if it does end up being functionally similar, but only a little bit weaker, then I will have to eat crow and say this is an amazing call that they made. Like, if it turns out this card is still able to keep the Sandman deck alive, my apologies to Glenn Jones. You nailed it. If it turns out this card does not keep the Sandman deck alive, then I start having questions about how long other things like this can survive. Mockingbird is losing a point of power. She has been a perennial performer in many meta decks for an extended period of time, whether that be the Thanos decks as she came out, the Thena decks that hybridized her and Mysterio into their natural environment, the decks that are still playing Cersei and Annihilus still want her, or more recently, the Tens deck where she is the glue of that archetype. I worry for the success of the Tens deck after losing this card, I really do. It's possible that maybe the whole environment is now a little lower, but that deck was already a deck that was sort of predicated on a specific matchup type thing existing, where it's like, we're here to blank Alioths, and as long as there's a lot of Alioths and not a lot of Shang-Chis, we're in a good situation. That might not be true anymore. Who the hell knows? And Mockingbird was the glue. Mockingbird was the card that made your other cards make more sense. Yeah, okay, you're running 1-drops to play Cull Obsidian, but you're running Squirrel Girl because she also discounts Mockingbird. Sure, you're playing Mysterio in order to play Sasquatch, but you're playing Mysterio in order to play Mockingbird too. And the fact that she's now no longer discounting Scar makes that deck just fundamentally make a lot more sense. A lot less sense, jeez. It makes it make a lot less sense, not a lot more sense. Very, very, very much less sense. I almost wonder if she's still the best card to run in there. And if she is, the deck's probably unplayable. Like, with the Tens in the situation that they're in right now, I just don't see how this deck can survive losing what I think I can reasonably describe as the best card in the deck. This is the card that makes that deck go, and it makes that deck go because it is 10 power. It's so good that it might still be the best option in that deck, despite no longer even discounting your Scar. Mockingbird is a beast. She has been a beast. She will continue to be a beast. I also wanted to talk about the no doubt minor opinion, but still one worth addressing, that this card lost a point of power, and therefore it's better in a Shang-Chi, and therefore this is actually a buff. No, it's not. That has never happened. They specifically mentioned in the notes that has never actually happened. And I think more importantly, that assumption is predicated on the idea that there is a lot of Shang-Chi in the metagame. This is perhaps the least Shang-Chi heavy metagame we've ever been in. And the success of the Tens deck actually stands as evidence to that. People were just playing these Tens out there and saying, you're not running Shang, it's fine. Shang's play rate in top 10% Infinite has almost never been lower. The provenance, or the prevalence of Alioth Wiccan decks, just the amount of things like that in the metagame, made it very hard to find value for your Shang-Chi. The addition of Madam Web has brought Shang-Chi perhaps back into focus as people start experimenting with these sort of Vulture and Dagger and Human Torch things. But again, this is a metagame that is very much without him. I do not think that in any world this is actually going to be a buff to Mockingbird. I do think that she could remain pretty good. Arrow is getting a 1 point of power buff. I do not know how relevant this will be in the current moment. I am happy that there are more 5 double-digit cards, because one of the really things that's bugged me recently about Marvel Snap is how few of those there were. I sort of have this thing where I talk about how all 5-drops are either legions or devil dinosaurs, where it's like, either they're like a 5/7, 5/8 utility, or they're like a 5 arbitrarily large big guy, where it's like 5/17, 5/19 kind of deal, like Gilgamesh or Devil Dino or whatever you have there. And I've always felt like there was sort of unexplored design space for cards that were sort of in the middle of that, where it's like your ability isn't as good as Legion, so maybe you're a 5'11, maybe you're a 5'10. And I feel like this is one of the situations where Shang-Chi legitimately does limit this kind of design, because these turn 5 cards coming out being very vulnerable to Shang-Chi, you're spending all 5 of your energy on them. If you get Shang-Chi'd, Shang-Chi is trading up. This kind of card is actually the specific kind of card that is more vulnerable to that. But I do think that perhaps there's going to be something to the idea of a future move your opponent's cards deck. Once the card Scream comes out, it was data mined, a 2/2 that when one of your opponent's cards moves for the first time in a turn, it gets +2 power, and that card gets -2 power, and Arrow getting more power could be a meaningful improvement to that deck. And I think that that's a really solid thing for it to be. I do understand the people, and I am kind of one of these people, who think that Arrow should just get her old effect back where she moved everything and be like a 5/6. But at the same time, I'm happy they're exploring the spaces above 5/9 for utility cards. I don't know what the result is going to be, but I do think it's a good thing that they're finally willing to sort of break the seal on that and say, you know what? We make 3 5s with upside. I'm pretty sure we can make a 5/10 that does something, if that something isn't actually all that amazing. And right now, Arrow's ability is not all that amazing. It's a great surprise card, but it's too niche and specific and priority focused to have been a meaningful card in a lot of different decks. I will say I was fairly disappointed with the idea that Arrow would just go into the 10s deck instead of Mockingbird, which they seem to allude to in the notes. Not a good substitution, guys. Black Cat is gaining a point of power up to 410. This is a card that has basically only ever seen play in Hela decks, and I don't necessarily feel the greatest about buffing Hela. I feel like I'm getting some real mixed signals off of this patch, where it's like, okay, we're gonna nerf Sandman because the play pattern sucks, but here's a Black Cat buff for the Hela lovers. Here's, in the future, potentially a Hellcow buff for the Hela lovers. They referenced that in the season video. And it's like, wait, okay, so that's okay, but Sandman's not okay? What are we actually doing here? I will say, I'm pretty glad they did what they did to Sandman before Hela came out, but honestly, I can still see Hela running that card. The more I make this video, the more I talk myself into Sandman, but that's sort of beside the point. We're here to talk about Black Cat. I am generally of the opinion that this is a card that only ever really exists in one deck. She's not really going to make it out of that archetype. She's going to be in Hela, she's going to be in Black Knight, she's going to be in Black Knight Hela. She has a very specific niche. I have no issue with putting extra power on her as long as they're willing to deal with what happens when that archetype becomes incredibly prevalent. I do think the game as a whole is more set up to deal with a world in which Hela is good. It was successful in a very specific metagame where there just weren't many ways to go over the top of it, to do points in a more efficient way, and I do think that right about now, we will be able to do that in a way that is more meaningful than we were at the time. However, it is still a risk, and I'm not always in favor of them making the risky play. This is the lowest risk Hela buff they could do, though, and I am sort of in favor of that. Generally, also, I am in favor of just going back through the card catalog and being like, what cards can we give +1 power to? And it does sort of feel like that's what happened here. Like, this patch, there's a lot of like, let's just go through Series 1 through Series 3 and be like, let's see if we can throw some power on some stuff. Let's just put some +1s on things. Let's update things. Let's get things up to the level of power that they might need in order to see play in a metagame. One of the interesting things to me, though, is that so often that just actually doesn't do it. It's actually pretty rare for that to be enough to make those cards playable in the metagame. It is something that is undeniably worth doing, though, especially in light of all these conversations about power creep, and I do have to commend them for finding a bunch of cards that can get a point of power for free, and they don't really run the risk of them running over the metagame. Black Cat, certainly one of those cards. Ghost Rider could be another one of those cards. I am generally of the opinion that the power on a card like this matters a lot less than you would think. This is a card that when you look at it, you're like, oh my god, that's a big boost to the power. It went from 3 to 4. That's a lot. That's a big boost. You get 33% more power. That rocks. Here's the thing. Ghost Rider's actually mostly playing for like 15 power anyway. This doesn't do enough to make it a reasonable play when it's not pulling something out of the board. And that is what would be necessary for this to be a real splashable thing, I think. There is one change in this patch that might actually make Ghost Rider playable, but I don't think it's this one. And we'll have to see how that goes. But I don't really think of going from 4-3 to 4-4 as something that is meaningful. If they wanted to make Ghost Rider legitimately, potentially strong, the way to go about doing that is give him like an Iron Lad stat line sitting at 4-6, but that is just a pretty risky thing to do. The idea with that would be we want him to be a card that can be splashed easily. So one really, really easy way to make a card good is to reduce the downside on it while leaving a very high upside. Obviously, that might not be a good design decision. That might not be a good balance decision. But they do have the power to do that. If they wanted to make Ghost Rider good, they opted far more conservatively. They mentioned in the notes something that really kind of like, it was like, oh, wait, really? You guys think about that? Where they said in the beta, they learned that 3-3 Ghost Rider was too strong. And I think that that is probably a heuristic you should probably update. Like, I'm willing to say, you know, maybe 3-3 Ghost Rider is too strong. I'm willing to buy that, right? Like, I buy that. But I don't think the fact that it was too strong in the beta, and the context in which we had it in the beta was like, it was a much lower power game. B, people were still making their way through Series 3, Series 4, still making their way through Series 3. Series 4 and 5 didn't exist. And so a lot of what we did in the beta was like, you'd play a Sarah, and then your final turn would be like a strong guy who cost 2 at the time. And then you would play like Blade, your America Chavez, which you knew would be in your hand because it was always the last card you would draw. And then Ghost Rider that Chavez to the board so you get consistency and power. And it's like, the game has changed so much since then that I find the justification of we tried this in the beta and it was too strong to be a little bit spurious, if you ask me. I don't think that's a good enough justification for not doing it. I think, I mean, like, the Occam's razor here is they were just like, we don't want to risk it. And that's a totally fine justification. Like, we don't want to risk it. All right, whatever, you know, I get it. But I do think that this is one of those cases where they could have gone farther in a way that would have pushed new archetypes forward. And I'm a little sad that they didn't, honestly, because Ghost Rider, as much as I've, like, demonstrated this animosity for Hela is an issue because it sort of invalidates everything else that happened in the game, and the game becomes only about this. Ghost Rider is the kind of card that you, like, play as part of a splash, you play as part of a, like, additional thing that you're trying to do. Look, I don't know, but I do think that Ghost Rider going in only one lane is just, like, vastly more acceptable to me. Now, here's a card that I genuinely don't know if they could have gone any further with, because Moon Girl's actually just pretty scary. The issue, I think, is that it's almost impossible to say that this card should go to 3. If you put this card to 3, I think you are nearly instantly creating a new Tier 1 archetype. So the only real options you have are to add power to her. Because at 3, suddenly you're just doing a whole lot of really crazy stuff with Quinjets and things like that. This is a card where I think, as hypocritical as this may be of me, you can say, hey, we tried this at 3 in the beta, it was ridiculous, and we don't want to ever do that again. And I think that Moon Girl being a tool for consistency and broken things, for attacking multiple lanes, for doing things that are extremely powerful multiple times, that is something that has been shown to be very strong over the course of the game in multiple situations, where Ghost Rider just being a very big guy that you have to set up. I think we've had plenty of those and they've mostly been fine. Duplicating stuff, having a copy of stuff. They just nerfed Taskmaster because of how annoying it was when you would, like, have something you put all your effort into and then magically just have 2 of them because you have to win 2 lanes in Marvel Snap, right? And so I think it is much riskier to take this card to 3 than it would be to take Ghost Rider to 3 for those reasons. And so you end up sitting in a situation where it's like, all right, let's go to 5, let's go to 6, let's see what happens. They ended up on 5. I don't think that's going to be particularly meaningful. I do think that right now, Moon Girl decks are and have been genuinely underrated. Yo Woody has been playing Moon Girl decks on and off, and while I realize, you know, Yo Woody could do well with kind of any pile, I do think that they are genuinely underrated. One of the things that he's done very well in building them is to include cards that allow the deck to curve out and not be only a Moon Girl deck. We are also more equipped to handle Moon Girl decks than we otherwise were, by which I basically mean Mobius exists, and a lot of Moon Girl decks are predicated on doing stuff like that. Eliath exists, and if you have Mobius and Eliath, it's just like, okay, so here's the deal. You have really only a couple options in your Moon Girl deck. One of them is She-Hulk. The other one is like Sage US Agent. Those are the things you're trying to do a lot of. When you can't do either of those things because of the combination, the 1-2 punch of Mobius Eliath, the deck kind of does end up unplayable. I'm not saying taking this to 3 would have made it an unsolvable problem, but this is a much safer thing for them to do. I do think that they might have erred on the side of too safe. I can't really see a reason why this can't have a 4-6 stat line. I could be off base about it. Maybe it's just not okay to give card advantage, and it's just not okay for this card to be above rate. But, I mean, like, when you compare it to White Queen, who is underpowered, how much better is Moon Girl? A lot. But how underpowered is White Queen? A lot. And so it's like, I don't really think this card can't have a 4-6 stat line, but it might be in deference to stuff like White Queen, in deference to the fact that this is a, I believe, a pool 1 card, at the very least a pool 2 card, that they don't really want to push it too much, and so they end up sort of pigeonholed. If you can't make it cheaper, okay, we can't make it cheaper. You can't make it above 4-6 because it's a pool 1 card. Okay, you only really have one stat line you can put on it. There you go. War Machine is now an ongoing ability. Perhaps this is what he should have been all along. War Machine's ability to now allow you to play wherever you want, whenever you want, is a legitimately powerful one. There is one combination of cards that I think many people are going to focus on, and genuinely with good reason. That combination of cards is Storm into War Machine into Legion on the Storm lane. Now, you might be saying, KM, how are you going to Legion on the Storm lane? To which I say, you should read War Machine again. What this does is effectively create a situation where your opponent can't play turn 6. We have recreated Sandman in the aggregate. Here's the interesting thing about it, though. One of the issues that this kind of strategy often has is as a 2-cube wonder. This is the kind of thing that's only ever winning 2 cubes, and it's never, ever, ever going to make anyone get to showdown. What is the meaningful difference behind this strategy and, say, clogging up one of your opponent's lanes and playing Cannonball on another? Is there a meaningful difference there in terms of power? Is there a meaningful difference there in terms of snap equity? Not sure. And I think right now, the advantage goes to the Cannonball type strategy, where if you're trying to set up a deterministic win, that's a much better way to do it because your opponent is actually going to turn 6. You have the same snap equity, but they might actually stay in the game. Here's the other thing, though. I don't think you should underestimate the power of having a free snap. Because I do think that when you do Storm, War Machine, Legion, you're probably never going to lose the game. You're probably never, ever, 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 ever losing the game unless your opponent also has a War Machine, right? It's just not happening, right? Skipping that final turn is so nuts. It's so strong. It's very good. And maybe that kind of snap equity in a deck is meaningful. Is there a deck that can support Storm, War Machine, Legion? Can we be playing that in whatever good cards pile? Can we take the old Sandman shell and just jam that in there and say, look, check out my new Sandman. It does what it does. I don't know. I'm interested in finding out. I think a lot of people are all over the place on this combo. I think generally the better players that I know think it's going to be kind of ass, and a lot of the, no offense, worse players that I know think it's going to be very good. And normally I tend to side with, I'm like, oh yeah, the better players. I actually have some worries about this one. Like, I get it. Maybe I'm overblowing it. I get it. But having that guaranteed snap does seem like a really strong thing to hybridize into your deck. If you're playing a good stuff mid-range deck, I would try to hybridize that in. Issues include Madam Web just came out, so if you don't have the full combo, you just have to be a Storm deck, and it's kind of bad to be a Storm deck right now. War Machine at 4-7 isn't bad stats, but like compared to something like a Wiccan deck, you have this Legion that's like super, like it's not telegraphed per se, but it kind of is. And your cube equity seems like it would be pretty minimal. I am a fan of free wins. I love winning games for free. I want to take the combo that wins games for free and play that in an already good deck. And that's sort of where I think it could end up being problematic. I don't think Lockdown as a strategy is going to end up good. But that package, if you can fit it into some other stuff, I may actually have some hope for. Obviously, metagame dependent. There are cards like, your opponent's Legion, your opponent's War Machine. Very bad for you in these situations. A lot of things can be really bad for you. But I am interested to see if this can bring a card, Storm, who has gone from being an amazing card to a very bad one over the course of the time I've been playing Marvel Snap, back into the spotlight in a meaningful way. I don't think it'll bring lockout decks into this. I think it'll be much stronger as a small package. That's, I'm KM Best. That's what I do. I'm Paul Smackage. But I do actually have some interest in this, where I think a lot of other top players just look at this and say, no, that's like a combo for bad players. I don't have the same disdain for it, but I don't think you're going to start playing Lockout all of a sudden. This is kind of a crazy one. Agatha Harkness is now no longer controlling all of your turns, just the even ones. So 2, 4, and 6. I have no clue what this means. Agatha being like effectively bigger Chavez now, because she starts in your hand and you get to play turn 1, and yeah, she's gonna play turn 2, but how bad is that? And then you can discard her on turn 3 with Lady Sif, or like wave on turn 3, and you can always make sure you're playing that stuff. And like, maybe that's just really good. Maybe you can just like Lady Sif, guarantee it, go off, Ghost Rider her. Like, is this a Hela card now? I don't know. Maybe. Like, there's just kind of a lot that strikes me as actually legitimately kind of worrying about this. And I don't necessarily think that, like, it's gonna be as amazing as I think, but I have some fears. I do. On the other side of the sort of fear weight thing that I'm doing here is, we've had a location that was Agatha for one turn. It sucked. Everyone hated it. And they eventually had to realize that, like, hey, a card playing your, like, it was the turn 5, the original version of Krakoa played for you on turn 5. And they eventually realized that there was basically no difference between that and Ego or Agatha, where it was just like, yeah, so a lot of people's game plans really come down to that one. I wonder about this one, though. I wouldn't be surprised if there was something that could actually happen here. The other thing I wanted to talk about that this does is absolutely murder what I like to affectionately refer to as the Agatha Fight Club. There's a group of players who literally just season pass farm with Agatha in their decks, and now they are no longer going to be able to do that. They're going to have to make plays in their Agatha season pass farm decks, which ruins the point of an Agatha season pass farm deck. What are they doing, guys? I guess they finally got tired of it. Did you know that those Agatha season pass farmers are also why we have a booster cap? Like, almost every cap that we have in Marvel Snap is because people were trying to abuse Agatha in order to free roll a bunch of rewards. And, I guess I can't really get mad at card gamers for optimizing. That's why they come to my channel. But still, it is kind of crazy to think about that. I'm not going to say I'm going to play with Agatha, right? This is the kind of card that someone else is going to break, and then I'm going to be like, damn, they did it, let's go. But I do think there's actually, like, for the first time ever, a reason to look at her. I'm not saying it's a compelling reason. I'm not saying it's going to last. But there is some upside to a card starting in your hand and thinning the deck, and we just need to figure out how bad the downside is on the other end of it. And I would not be surprised if I saw people at least trying this out. I wouldn't be. I am interested to see what it ends up looking like, but genuinely, there are things that this card does that are kind of interesting in terms of deck thinning, in terms of all of that. And I think overall, my worry would be for something like Hela, where this is just a very scary thing. Of course, you do have to discard it before Hela, so hey, at least it won't play Hela for you on turn 6. Always play Agatha. But yeah, I don't really expect this card to be everywhere or to be like a metagame deck, but I do think there is like a percentage chance, a fairly low one, that someone figures out something that isn't terrible to do with this. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it through that video. As always, I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. And before I end it, I just wanted to say a little bit of a shout out to Jen Bartel. After the sort of kerfuffle over paying artists, I was trying to figure out what I could do. What I ended up doing was ordering a shirt off of her website. It's pretty sick. I hope that you were able to enjoy it throughout the video. And please check out her website. I generally thought that the points she raised about paying artists were super dope, and I wanted to do something that I could do to contribute to supporting art. And this is like a very small gesture, but it's one I wanted to make regardless. So if you feel like making a similar gesture, please do check it out. Hashtag not sponsored. No one paid me to do this. I paid for this, and I'm doing this of my own free will. As always, enjoy. I've been KM Best. I will see you out there. You have been phenomenal.